folks. You know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it means it's time for another edition of the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Reid, Blefsterini in the home game, and Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. And I've got the best freaking job in the world because I get to hang out here every week with my poker friends, talking to fun and amazing people in the world of poker. And because of most of what we do here at Rec Poker is free, we're a largely volunteer organization. I got to thank our sponsors, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, and website Mark over at website AMP. And of course, I also have to thank our premium members, like one of our newest premium members, Oliver Blouth. Oliver joined last week. I haven't had a chance to meet him yet, but I'm looking forward to getting to know Oliver better and showing him all that his new premium membership at Rec Poker has to offer. So thank you, Oliver. And thanks to all our free community members. If you don't know what Rec Poker is about, it's a free community. We play live, we play online, we learn together, we learn from each other's mistakes, we study together, we have fun, and we do it the right way. It's free to join. Just go to rec.poker and sign up. All it takes is an email address and a smile. But that's enough about me, because it takes a village to do what we do here at Rec Poker. That's why I'm joined here every week by the Wrecking Crew, several members thereof at least. This is the core team of folks here that contribute their time every month, putting our strategy videos together and adding their insights to the podcast. So if you want to find out more about the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew, or you can just listen up because you're going to meet a few of them right now.
I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the Poker Stars home game.
And I'm John Somsky. I am Poker Geek MN everywhere.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I am currently PetVet33 on the Poker Stars home game and PetVet_33 on Twitter.
And I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Rabman50 just about everywhere.
And we are going to be interviewing Matt Berkey tonight, longtime pro, friend of the show, founder of the Solve for Why Academy. And if you stick around to the end of the show, just like we do every week, we're going to give away a prize. It's free to enter. The prize this week is going to be a free month of access to Solve for Why, brought to you by Matt Berkey. So I'm excited for that, and I'm excited to be welcoming Matt Berkey back to the show. Matt, thank you so much for coming back on the Rec Poker Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now you've sort of traveled all over the poker sphere. You were a player forever. I know you've done a ton of coaching. Solve for Why is really the feather in your cap, but even Solve for Why has sort of changed a bit over the years. I know now you're really focusing on the academy. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about like what you're up to right now in the world of poker?
Oh man, it's tough to say. It seems like it changes so frequently, but the thing that I don't think anybody really prepares for whenever you enter this game professionally or take it as a serious hobby is that as you graduate through the stakes, there's just less availability to play. So, over the past 10 years or so, I really started playing high stakes live, and year over year, those games just become a little bit less available. So I would say probably over the last year or so, my hours have been cut a little bit more. So I've leaned a little bit more into the business side of things. I've also leaned a little bit more into tournament study because that seems to be the area of the poker economy that's growing the fastest and is the most readily available. So I think it's important to kind of be sharp in all aspects of the game, not just have one little niche area that you want to be good at.
And what has that meant for Solve for Why? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what Solve for Why started with and sort of how it's progressed and evolved over time?
Yeah, sure. So we launched the company in 2016, and the idea was that there just wasn't really anything that was very live focused. I know Crush Live Poker existed at the time, but even that was just mostly like a hand review type of site that was utilizing the live at the bike footage as a means to teach through application. So we really wanted to target people who were hitting that plateau in their career that maybe have been 2-5 grinders for too long and couldn't really find a path to elevating through the stakes. It was kind of a methodology for me to attempt to duplicate or replicate the way that I learned the game. And at that point, we only had the academy as a product. So we initially launched in 2016. We ran 2 academies pretty successfully. 2017, we expanded out and ran more. And then by 2018, we realized that there was a need for continued education. And moreover, that the landscape was very quickly changing. So the evolution of the academy began as me just speaking pretty candidly about how I thought about the game and the way that I went about digesting information and learning and testing new stuff, all the way to present day where, we've pretty much built a bulletproof list of protocols that students can kind of adhere to create a logical framework in the way that they think and solve problems anytime they're at the table. So obviously this is a lot of a byproduct of computers and sims being a big part of the landscape. Whereas in 2016, I think we were like 1 year into PO Solver existing. Mm-hmm. And, for the most part, the best players in the game were the ones who could intuitively come up with some of these solutions on the fly. So that was the way that the game was taught. Now we have a lot more empirical knowledge of the underlying math of the game. And we have these kind of anchors and bullet points to defer back to. So everything now is kind of built off of the fundamentals of game theory and the logical framework that it provides, still allowing for a lot of freedom whenever it comes to how we interpret that math and how it applies in real time. Because the fact of the matter is these solvers are only as good as the parameters that you enter. And it's impossible to have perfect information in an imperfect game. So we're kind of just estimating whenever we're looking at vacuum situations, and we're trying to extrapolate off of the data that we receive, but we suck at that as humans. It's just not something where our brains are really wired for,
Yep. So I'll as I say every week, if you're in the YouTube chat, feel free to type your questions into there, and we'll get your answers. We'll get your question in front of Matt freaking Berkey. That's why you got to come on here to the Rec Poker podcast, live recordings on Monday nights at 7:30 Eastern. And of course, anyone here in the panel that wants to ask any questions, just unmute, and I'll call on you in a moment. So Matt, one of the things that you were talking about there that really interested me was this kind of framework for learning that you were describing, because the way that people approach the science of learning, like the process of learning, I feel like that really informs curriculum and how we bring people along. How did you and your team kind of decide what was the best way to approach poker learning, and what's the best way to build the track for someone to come along?
Yeah, I think that I got very lucky with who I surrounded myself with. Christian and I, we've kind of reverse engineered this game from the beginning. We've learned kinesthetically and then have kind of like reverted back to seeing how that attributes to the underlying math as more and more is discovered. Whereas Matt, Hunt, and Landon come from a much more solver-based background, and they kind of learn the game from the micro to the macro. So for Christian and I, it's always just like basic principles, big macro concepts that we are constantly whittling down to more precision by asking deeper questions. We follow the scientific method, if you will. But for us, everything begins with a hypothesis. For guys like Landon and Hunt that I would consider like technicians, they kind of reverse engineer the scientific method, if you will. So they kind of start by testing, right? Where you just get a spot and you look at it in the solver. That's kind of the testing phase. And then you start to deduce some things as you recognize patterns, as you recognize shifts in the math, the equilibriums, how equity moves dependent upon turn or river distributions, things of that nature. And then they arrive at bigger picture points. So for us, it's pretty fortunate in the sense that we have the methodology moving in both directions, right? We have guys that are really strong at the macro concepts and guys that are really precise at the micro concepts. And that kind of allowed us to brainstorm and just build out protocols that in real time, if you're not sharp one way or the other, you'll have something to defer to. So if you're the type of person who's looked at 10,000 sims, but you haven't really figured out what those patterns mean yet, or you haven't been able to bucket the math into certain qualitative buckets, if you will, so you could branch out and have more general strategies. Well, Matt and Landon will speak to you on that, right? It'll be, there's a precise betting structure that we can take dependent upon board texture and the other variables that are available. And if you're not really good with details like myself, Christian and I speak a lot more to those big picture macro concepts of, we're off of the always and never path, and we're more so in general type of speak. And we're asking more questions than providing answers, because that's what these tools are mostly utilized for, right? You shouldn't walk away from running a sim with a hypothesis that you had in place and walk away and say, okay, I proved my hypothesis, because you technically didn't. For all the information that we have on No Limit Hold'em right now, nothing is really concrete. Like nothing is really discovered as law, maybe EV to some degree, but like even the depth through which that calculation takes place is very difficult to nail down because of how variable in nature it is. So really what it is you hypothesize, you test, you then reframe your hypothesis in a slightly different way to skew the variables slightly differently. And then you test again. And now we look for consistencies and inconsistencies. That's where we start to arrive at more concrete ideas.
Well, I mean, that's exactly a scientific process. I mean, it's great to see that kind of scrutiny and meticulousness being taken to the lab of poker strategy. I think a lot of recreational players, they get into this. It's a fun game. It's more fun when you win. So we like to get better and to, find ways to win. And we like those kind of general rules too, like you're talking about. And I think you're right on when you say, like, you don't prove things, but you can disprove things.
Yes.
With that in mind, what do you think are some one or two common misconceptions that recreational players have that your study or your analysis has given you a chance to like pull the blindfold off and say, aha? Well, give me an example or two of that.
So I think the most common example of a misconception that recreationals will hold on to is that there's a perfect answer. So because they think in such specific terms to the spot that they're in, they think that there's a perfect way to play jacks based off of the action that's taken place, right? When the reality is we can't control outcomes. We can only control the EV of our decisions. And quite frequently, a hand like jacks is just near the top of our range, and you really can't mess it up, right? The only way you can mess up is by generally folding, right? Putting yourself in a position, backing yourself into a position where folding becomes the correct play. It means that you've made a bunch of missteps along the way. So an easy notion for this is sizing up so much preflop that jacks, quote unquote, get the protection that they need from overcards, right? What ultimately ends up happening is you fold out worse, and then you get better to play back against you, putting you in a position to now fold a high EV hand, right? So I think what ultimately happens whenever you want that simplification is that you steer yourself into negative EV decision points in order to make them easier, right? Because a negative EV decision is pretty easily felt. You know when bottom pair is no good. You recognize when you're getting the wrong price for a draw. And you put in enough money to quote unquote see where you're at with jacks to where whenever you get shoved on, you can understand that like this hand isn't really worth anything to me any longer. And since folding is 0 EV, I'll take the lesser of two evils, right? The problem is that the mistake occurred up until that point. So you made a negative EV sizing that led to a response. Well, let's say you made the lowest EV sizing whenever you choose the big size, and it led to a negative EV response to where the range that is now playing back at you is exploitative. It lacks bluffs because it doesn't need it, right? It just forces you into a window where you can no longer play your hand profitably.
So that kind of ties into, we hear this all the time, like you've allowed your opponent to play perfectly against you because they're folding everything worse and they're only continuing with better hands. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people talk to me about that. And there's some tension between that and the idea of like adding fold equity to your hand by shoving with a hand that maybe will get better hands to fold. Can you just kind of explain that tension a little bit, or maybe why people get caught in that mindset?
I think what happens is that people don't understand how high in equity some of the middling strong hands actually are. So for instance, if we look at a board texture like 9-6-3, what would you estimate the equity of a hand like ace-9 to be?
Let me see. Ace-9 on 9-6-3.
Yeah.
Pretty good. And that's got to be over 50. What does the rest of the group here think? 55, 60%? They're putting me on the spot. Let's go with that, Matt.
Yeah, in a single raise pot, ace-9 versus a single defender is often going to be somewhere in like the 65 to 70 percentile range, right? It's akin to an overpair. Largely because the defender doesn't have overpairs and sets are really hard to make. So on a board texture like this, where 2-pair doesn't exist, sets are rare, and overpairs basically don't exist, a 9 is a very, very, very strong hand. What would you estimate a hand like 10-9 to be, for example?
Probably still pretty close to that, I would say.
Yeah. And I think that's where the misconception goes awry, is that there are people who look at that board texture and they see 9x and they overvalue it to the point where they recognize that it's vulnerable and that it's also high EV, right? And they overplay it because they want to fold out anything that could potentially suck out on them, right? And then there's this other camp that recognizes that it's actually a hand that's beaten very easily on this board texture through turns and rivers, and they don't play it aggressively enough because they don't recognize that, like, they see a huge difference between aces and ace 9 in this particular spot. The reality is that they're not that far apart whenever you're up against a range that's largely devoid of overpairs, and they both rank incredibly high on the EV side of things. So that's the first misconception, is people don't understand the actual spectrum of equity. Like, they don't understand how strong a 6 is on this particular texture, that it's like 50+% equity. They don't understand that Jack 10 versus a defending range here is going to be like 40% equity, right? It's largely misunderstood where our equity comes from and why hands that are high in equity have to fold. Like Jack 10, if played back against, has to fold because it can't realize, right? It has no path to sucking out, basically. But that doesn't mean that it's a nothing hand. We often like look at a hand that misses and we call it garbage, or we say it's nothing, right? Implying that it's like zero equity or damn near zero. Reality is it's actually quite high comparatively. Like deuces on 9-6-3 rainbow in a single raise pot, close to 50%. I think most people, though, would treat that hand as like an utter throwaway. It's a give up, right? And that speaks to equity realization properties. If you start putting in big bets with deuces, you're obviously only getting called by better, and that's a problem. Also, it may be 50% on this street, but the pot's not going to check down. Your opponent's going to get to realize portions of their equity. You're not going to be able to get value, et cetera, right? So that's all one side of the coin. The flip side, and this is where the majority of the mistakes come into play, is this notion that we can control fold equity. And this just comes from a misunderstanding of ranges, right? So going back to the Jacks example, that mistake occurs because you're thinking of a singular hand. You're not thinking of the incentive of your range as a whole, right? You're just thinking of how you can protect this one singular hand. Same thing happens with a 9. With aces, you don't have that much fear, right? You just know you have a pretty nutted hand. With ace 9, you're afraid of getting sucked out on, so you fast play and you go for these protection sizes. And for what it's worth on this texture, that's actually correct, but it's important to understand the reasoning why. So whenever we get wrapped up in this singularity where we're only focused on the exact candidate, we lose focus of the greater picture of the entirety of the range. And this is important more so for understanding the response than it is our own actual strategy. If we, to truth be told, like at the highest level, we're not playing range versus range in our strategy. We're actually playing hand versus range. But it takes being able to comprehend your own range before you can start to think about your opponents, right? So the reason why people make these fold equity errors is because they have no knowledge whatsoever of their opposition's range. They don't think that way, right? They just look at the board texture and they say, okay, 9-6-3, he could have 5-4, he could have 7-8, he could have a 9, he could have a 6, he could have a 3, he could have sets. And like, that's it. That's as far as the thought process goes. It never goes as far as like what backdoor hands are incentivized to continue, what types of suited versus unsuited cards. Like, we need the entirety of the range, because the fact of the matter is, in theory land, there's like no bet that you can make that starts to apply so much pressure to one pair that they have to start instantly folding on the flop, right? Outside of like all in. And this is generally true. Like an example I give at the Academy, Kim may be able to attest to this. She's been a couple of times. One of the examples I give is, say you're facing an all in on a similar board texture, 9-6-3, two-tone, and you hold the nut flush draw. How often should you fold, if ever?
Personally, I'm allergic to folding in that situation, so I'm probably not the right person to ask.
It's fair. Well, so generally speaking, let's say somebody shoves for 3 times the pot size. Who here would fold the nut flush draw in that sort of texture? That's really good that you guys at least have hesitation, because the general consensus is like, yes, I would insta-fold, right? But the nut flush draw in this particular scenario versus a range of hands is close to a coin flip. And there's dead money in the pot. So we can never be worse than 50% equity. It's impossible. As long as there are blinds, we'll always be getting laid the right price to at least have 50%, right? So in that instance, it becomes a huge mistake now to be folding the nut flush draw. But people will jam like queens for like 3x pot on 9-6-3 two-tone because they don't want to get sucked out on by a nut flush draw, not understanding that they're not even denying anything. So the point I'm trying to arrive at here is you don't have any control over the range of hands that folds. It just slightly expands and contracts based off the price that you laid. So if you bet quarter pot, they only fold like 15% of their hands, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, depending on the board texture. And it's just a matter of if they can meet MDF, right? Minimum defense frequency. So like on king, deuce, it becomes really hard for the big blind to meet minimum defense frequency on the flop. And if you bet quarter pot, they're probably overfolding by a significant chunk. Maybe they're only calling like 70% of hands instead of like 85. But on most textures, they'll meet MDF. And when you bet quarter pot, they're supposed to call with roughly like 85%. When you bet full pot, they're still supposed to call with like 66% of hands, they're still supposed to call, 66% of hands, right? So all you've done now is double their folding range, but it's a wide range. So it's not like middle pair suddenly becomes a part of that 66%, right? It's not like open enders start becoming part of that 66%. There's still plenty of automatic continues. And that's where I think people were confused, because for decades, if we bet big, top pair would fold. And that's just changed now that we've been able to examine this at a much deeper level, seeing how the math actually works and where we're actually generating EV from.
Yeah, so they're going to fold more, but they're going to be folding more of the hands that you were maybe ahead of already, or that you were doing better equity-wise against. So it doesn't actually help you. They're not folding the hands that you want them to fold.
Correct.
When you make that. So I think our listeners that were listening along, I think what they've heard is, if you have the nut flush draw, you should just always call every bet. Are there times where we might choose not to call, or where we might choose to raise instead, or something like that? Just give us something easy to follow, Matt. Yeah,
of course. So multi-way pots really monkey wrench this, and I'm sure a lot of you are accustomed to playing multi-way pots. So in those instances, it becomes a little bit weird. But again, remember that like there's almost nothing that can happen where you're going to get laid such a poor price that you're going to be forced into folding. So even if it goes like big bet and you call and then somebody jams behind you, you're still probably just going to get the right price to call. So like on the flop specifically, it's really difficult to outprice the nut flush draw. Now, obviously this will change if you have like the naked ace of clubs and it's like a jack 10-9 all club board. That's not the same. A, you're not even drawing to the nuts. B, there are fewer outs. As for all the money to go in, the equity threshold is now higher, so they need to have higher qualifying hands. As far as like when to raise, when not to, you just want to lean on very specific things. Like if we have the nut flush draw, we have some showdown value with ace high. So what types of textures would it behoove us to sacrifice the showdown value of ace high in order to get potentially better to fold? And the simple answer to that would be, well, we have a bad kicker. We think like ace king or ace queen will fold. Right. So jack 10 high boards are bad to do this on, but like a 9 high board, an 8 high board, a 7 high board, a lot better to now be check raising the nut flush draw, because what we're doing is we're pushing them off hands that dominate us at showdown. Should this hand just like play to checking down on turn, of course, there are going to be plenty of scenarios where we can be outpriced. We only have one card to come. So our realization goes down, as does our equity. So now all of a sudden, if we start facing like 2x pot on the turn, nut flush draws often have to either bluff or fold. And that's okay. That's part of the game. It's difficult for people to polarize in such a manner consistently. Like sometimes you'll just be denied your equity, and that's okay.
That's true. Man, I'm soaking this up. I'm loving this interview so far. Chris Jones, what do you have up for our man, Matt Berkey here?
Well, Matt, I've got two questions that are kind of related. One's from the audience and one's kind of from my perspective. You mentioned way at the beginning of the interview, the idea, I mean, I think a lot of players, even recreational players, now have access to charts and sims and maybe have some fundamental understanding, or maybe not. Maybe they're just looking at charts and following along. But the idea that you said at the beginning is they're only as good as the inputs we put into them. And one of the things I really valued about some of the Solve for Why content, especially some of the stuff that Matt Hunt's been doing lately, is looking at not just, okay, here it is at equilibrium, but here it is when we're facing an opponent who will never be three betting us with a polarized range. They're just going to be three betting us with, the top of range. And how does that change I really like that approach, and I'm really interested in learning more about that. But I'm curious about, sort of as a follow-up to that, how do you approach reading players at the table and deciding, are they this kind of player that I can make that adjustment towards? And then I have a follow-up, which is related from an audience question.
Sure. I think it's a really good question. This is something that we've started to incorporate more in the academy now that we have dynamic ranges on the Solve for Why site. So one of the big things that needs to be understood is that we can predict patterns of humans with relative accuracy, like not anywhere near 100%, but like 75% accurate is like pretty accurate, right? And when it comes to live, like mixing pre-flop just isn't really all that necessary. You could just like round your ranges out, where if a mixing candidate is like a high frequency open, low frequency fold, just raise it. If it's a low frequency open, high frequency fold, just fold it, that type of stuff. But through our observation and through conversation, we can kind of gauge how studied or unstudied somebody is and pick up off what their tendencies are likely to be. So there are plenty of people just through conversation and through watching their actions, you can recognize they're way too loose pre-flop and then way too tight post-flop, right? And what that will allow us to do is we can still look at a chart and we can just change the positioning in order to reflect the ranges that they're likely to play, right? So if you have a guy who's willing to flat pretty much from every position and three bets too tightly, what you can look at is a button range, right? And now no matter where you open from, you could just take that opening position and look at what the button response is and apply it to John Doe, who has that tendency, right? So it doesn't matter if he's under the gun one or cutoff or button, he's probably pretty inelastic and just plays the same strategy from all positions. And from that, we can now decipher how to move forward post-flop, because that's the most critical aspect that I think people miss. The only reason pre-flop ranges matter to us are they allow us to curate and calibrate our post-flop study. We can't study post-flop without inputting ranges, right? And I could just estimate a bunch of ranges and do a bunch of studying. And this is what was largely done in like 2016 to 2019. And my strategy will look wildly different than an OTB Red Baron who's putting in ranges for what he believes his six max online game to be. And they're just not going to parallel one another at all. I might be able to open like 22% under the gun where he's opening like 12, right? This is critical. Again, like I'm reverse engineering, right? When I first started the academy, I would just speak in general terms and just say like, look, I open the same range from all positions because nobody responds differently. They're all inelastic. They play the exact same ranges regardless of what position they're in. If everybody's ignoring position and I feel I have a post-flop edge, then I'm just going to VPIP as much as I can. Now that's changed a lot because people have seen charts and they see where the boundaries lie. So they recognize that like, suited kings become stronger the later in position that you may be. Suited connectors become weaker the earlier in position that you may be, that type of stuff. And we start to see these patterns emerge. So what becomes critical then is being mindful of how your strategy will shift dependent upon the type of opponent that you're at, right? So you can study for the general case, and this is largely what I do, but you better spend some time also looking at the guy who only plays button ranges from all spots, and then study the guy who only plays under the gun one ranges from all spots, like the 3-bet folder, where he just has no flats ever. You don't really need to be precise with what the quote unquote true equilibrium is if your environment never plays that equilibrium, because ultimately you're giving back a ton of EV. We have to remember that theoretical study and theoretical ranges are just an abstraction. So we are greatly reducing a lot of the details and the variables in order to get something that a computer can actually come up with. And as a byproduct of that, we are creating a minimally exploitative strategy. So basically, it's maximally defensive against anybody coming after us through obvious exploits. But just because we don't have obvious exploits doesn't mean that there aren't exploits available, and sometimes natural ones, right? We might just overfold to the guy who 3-bets way too widely because we don't care to acknowledge what he's doing and don't care to make any adjustments as a byproduct.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, thank you. That's a great answer. And then kind of to follow up on this, I think it's sort of related too. Like there's this sense of like, okay, we're going to study all these folks. We're going to kind of learn about the charts. We're going to kind of like dig in and think about, okay, against this type of player, I'm going to do X, and against this type of player, I'm going to do Y. And then we're sitting at the table and something happens. And here, so this is the question from our audience member from Dark Angel is, how do you take consideration body language and tells, or do you just simply go with your sort of like the stuff that you're working on and the math side of it? How much do you take into account behavior at the table?
Yeah. Big shout out to Donna. It's good to see her in the chat. I think in the past I had put more weight into this, but mainly because strategy was less, I don't want to say figured out. That's not fair to where we're at in the current learning stage, but strategy was less planned. It was less organized. And as a byproduct, you would just land in a lot of very close decisions where you didn't necessarily know what was going on. You had to rely a lot on your observation and on the environment. And a lot of money was just able to be made because ranges were very unprotected. So, and this probably still happens at a lot of the lower stake games as is. When people cap themselves early in a hand, you absolutely should take the most incentivized action, whether that's overfolding, overcalling, over bluffing, whatever, right? Like you should just always take advantage of when people turn their range face up and you become somewhat clairvoyant to them either lacking bluffs or having too many bluffs, being too value concentrated, whatever the case may be. You should absolutely respond accordingly. But understand that just means that your bluff catchers shift dramatically, right? So hands that are 0 EV in theory, if a person is under bluffing, become negative EV to now bluff catch with, right? Whereas in theory, if it's 0 EV, then it's indifferent and you'll bluff catch some of the time and you'll fold some of the time. If it's a plus EV bluff catcher, then it probably just becomes 0 EV if they lack bluffs. In other words, now what matters to us profiting is how thinly do they value bet, right? And the truth of the matter is people who lack bluffs tend to expand their value bets as a means of recourse to kind of getting enough value, right? Because the only way the top of range can perform is if there is some bottom that exists. Now, the exception to this would be like the old man coffee type, who every time he puts a chip in the pot, he's absolutely nutted, but everybody knows the response to that type of person, right? Sorry, Rob. We're going to have to work on that.
He tells a good story, but I think that's an image play as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I mean, if we just get you the suited will aces and let you rocket it off every time you get them dealt, you're fine. But yeah, so it's very critical to Donna's question to be observant, right? But the more strategic and the more sound your strategy is, the less incentive there is to deviate without some sort of environmental cue. When people make it obvious to me that I should shift off of my default strategy, I just do so. And otherwise, I'll use it as a weighted coin because the fact is I'm going to land on river in a lot of situations with hands that mix, call, and fold, right? And what I need to do, or what I need to understand, is that I can't always call and I can't always fold because then I become hyper exploitable. But it's live poker. I have more information available to me. So I'll use tells in that instance to lean into the always call or the always fold because I don't want to randomize. Randomization is only necessary if we're playing in equilibrium, but we're not. I know for a fact the person making the wager is imbalanced because he's human. And it's just a matter of like, how studied are they as to how great the imbalance is? And no matter how studied you are from a technical standpoint, you can still be very unstudied from a psychological standpoint. And no one is beyond reproach whenever it comes to being put in the hot box. So if you wait somebody out, if you have a keen eye for looking for physical tells, social cues, whatever the case may be, that may weight their range closer to bluffing or closer to value, you will be able to make better educated decision with your mixed hands, the hands that have zero EV, and it really doesn't matter what you do, right? You're just breaking even on the call or the fold. Where I try not to use it too much is when I have a hand that just like always calls, right? It's like maybe I'll use it as a way to calibrate my observation, right? Like I have a hand that always calls, so I know I'm already calling, but I'm unsure if they're bluffing or value betting. And maybe I can work a read out of that situation where I just wait them out. I look at their body posture. I look at their physicality, whatever, because I'm about to get perfect information. I know I'm calling, right? So I'll try to like calibrate that, take all of that in, make the call, and then get the feedback that I'm looking for. It's either going to be a bluff or a value. If it's a bluff, now all those points of interest I was looking at register to me. Like, oh, the neck was pulsating, or they were breathing heavily, or they shot a glance at the player to the whatever little subtle things you pick up on, right? But if they have value and you notice all those cues, you now know that they mean nothing. So at a minimum, you can at least dismiss those things in the future.
Mm-hmm. We've got actually another question from Joe Koulis in the chat. He's asking about Solve for Why. He's saying Solve for Why intends to teach the approach that you took in studying the game, but to understand the game at this level requires a substantial amount of both cognitive skills and discipline. Do you think that's really teachable?
The discipline, yes, for sure. The cognitive skills, I think everybody has something to work with. So I think that dictates what your ceiling will ultimately be. And no two people are alike in the sense that the ceiling of a math genius who is hyper calculated along linear thought process doesn't necessarily have a higher ceiling than somebody who's a social genius, right? That's a little bit weaker in the math. They just have a different methodology and a different process to getting where they want to go. So I don't necessarily think that sheer raw intelligence is an indicator of a high ceiling. And as far as the discipline goes, that's why we use trainers. That's why we use charts and things of that nature. It's because it creates boundaries. We're not doing it to follow it rigidly. We're doing it to save you from yourself, to protect you from whatever predisposed fear, like fight or flight response you have. If you're a fighter, your ranges are too wide. If you're the type to flight, then your ranges are going to be too tight and you're going to be very averse to risk. In any event, like the prescribed ranges will fix that, because it'll say like, look, here's the boundary. You're two pips too wide or you're 2 pips too tight. And you don't have a justified reason to do that yet because you're not good enough. So stick to this plan, start to understand why this boundary exists, and keep training yourself into that level of discipline.
I've got another one just come in from Pierre. So Pierre's asking about I don't really have the time or the money to buy a solver. But so what are the alternatives out there? What are some of the cheapest ways to get studied in GTO, in your opinion?
Sure. Well, I think hiring a good coach is the easiest way, whether that's one-on-one or being a part of a community and just talking to peers. Both of those things are extremely helpful in that regard. There are also tools out there like GTO Wizard that's a pre-solved database, and they have a built-in trainer, right? So if you want to, you could just go to the trainer. You could set up spots that you feel weak in, and you could just play like you're playing poker, right? You'll just get dealt a bunch of spots over and over again, and it'll grade those spots and give you the ability to like look at the solver and understand how it's how you're failing, how you're succeeding, things of that nature. Those tools really do circumvent the solving process, which is good. Personally, like I don't really run sims. I never have. I never felt a need to, because I've always understood pretty deeply how the algorithm works, how the EV calculations are coming to be. And I could just speak with people who are very diligent at running sims and hear their thought process, hear the patterns that they recognize, and then deduce for myself like how that applies. Like, okay, if you tell me that small pocket pairs start to turn themselves into bluffs on this category of of board textures, right? Like we see like these double Broadway board textures, these Jack 10 high board textures, whatever, where as the preflop aggressor, you take your small pairs and you turn them into bluffs. Well, that seems very counterintuitive. But if you tell me something like that and I sit and think about it for a while, I'll look at all the variables individually and see what allows this to take place. And what you ultimately come to realize is that the board texture changes frequently. So these small pocket pairs have a difficulty realizing their equity. They also have clean outs to making a relatively nutted hand whenever you start bluffing with them and you peel off a set on turn or river. And they unblock hands that like have high enough equity that have called once or twice, but unimproved ultimately have to fold. They also unblock a lot of the middling equity hands like middle pairs and things of that nature that either auto fold on the flop if they're under pairs to the board, or they end up arriving at a fold on turn or river, depending. In essence, what I'm getting at is I'm much more of a theoretical thinker and an exploitative person who like applies, whereas people who are very technically sound at this game tend to be a little bit weak in the theoretical thought, but very strong in the execution, right? So what we have to understand is like, first you need to intimately know what drives you to getting better. If you're the type of person who's really good at data analysis, you should get a solver. You should just commit to getting a solver, right? If you really stink at detail-oriented stuff, but you're a big picture thinker, then you should get a coach who's detail-oriented, right? Just find the thing that complements you in this space and allows you to grow your logical process whenever you're in real time.
I know Kim's got one more question for us before we let you go, Matt. I just want to remind our audience that if you want to enter our draw at the end of the show, we're going to give away compliments of Matt Berkey here, a free month at Solve for Why. All you have to do is enter the words food bank into the chat right now. So just type food bank into the chat and you'll be entered into the contest draw. Kim, what was your question?
Well, first, Matt, I'd like to thank you for this great coaching session.
Yeah, no kidding.
But I actually have a Matt Berkey interview question.
Okay.
You started this Friends Only podcast, and I just wondered how you sort of what the origin of that was and how you can possibly do a podcast a day when I have trouble organizing one a month.
Sure. Well, first, I'm very lucky with the team I'm surrounded by. I've already said that once, and this expands out now further because you're kind of seeing the inner workings of Solve for Why with the Only Friends podcast, right? Like Brian has been the manager of Solve for Why for the better part of 5 years, but he's very much behind the scenes. Only attendees really get to know him. Same thing with Conrad. He's been dealing these forever. His personality kind of gets to shine through. Melissa, Landon, they're my roommates. They're my friends. They're also a part of the company in some capacity. So their support and the fact that there's 6 or 7 of us makes it a lot easier. I'm the only one who really has to be consistent. So as long as I can show up 5 days a week, we'll have a show, right? Because some skeleton crew of the other 6 will be able to fill a couple seats and give me somebody to bounce ideas off of and things like that. The inspiration, I guess, was just that I saw a huge, similar to the Academy, similar to Solve for Why being born to begin with, I just saw a huge gap in the market where there are like, I think there's something like 137 poker podcasts that are currently active, and none of them are more than weekly, right? So there was literally not one piece of content that was daily, keeping the community up to date on all the happenings going on. And when Christian and I used to do the vlogcast, what would happen so frequently is we were scheduled to go every Tuesday and we stayed consistent with that. But oftentimes something would happen on Wednesday or Thursday that was incredibly relevant to the point where like we would consider just doing an emergency show to make sure that it wasn't gone and forgotten. And ultimately, if we chose not to do that, by the time next Tuesday rolled around, the story was dead. It just wasn't important anymore. And, you know, we use Twitter to get that megaphone out there and like talk to people, but it doesn't really help grow the community in the same way. So I thought this was a huge opportunity for us to become a staple source in the community as a whole for all things poker. Also, it's another arm to Solve for Why that can hopefully reach out to other adjacent communities that potentially have interest in poker. And it can be a potential revenue source for us moving forward as well, because let's be honest, like we've been doing this for a long time. The poker training space is amazing, but there isn't a whole lot of meat on the bone. So this has been more of an exercise in learning about business, learning how to build something from scratch, how to scale and things of that nature. But it certainly hasn't been a fruitful one. So if we can put together a daily show that starts to bring in outside advertisers, it starts to bring in outside communities, outside marketplaces, that does a lot of heavy lifting for the company as a whole.
That's great. So my last question, what we're all dying to really know, what week is Kenny Pickett going to start under center?
Man, I actually am very confident he doesn't start this year.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you sound very confident. Okay, I was thinking like after the bye week maybe, but no, you're locked in.
I think Trubisky is serviceable, and I think Tomlin is very, I don't know if old school is the right word, but he is like just very diligent to the notion of we have a competent vet and this kid needs to learn a pro style offense. Also, I think it's kind of one of those things where it's like the more the fans cheer for Kenny, the more Tomlin's just like, you're not going to run my team kind of thing and push it back.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like it's really frustrating because defensively, they're a championship caliber defense. Offensively, they have a lot of the skill positions in place necessary to win, but their offensive line is so terrible that they're a 7-win team no matter who's under center. And there's just really nothing that can be done about that. Luckily, the receiving core, the running back, super young. So we have them for a period of time where hopefully we can grow an offensive line. The defense, though, is aging. Micah, he's still in his prime, but like 3 to 5 good years left. Cam Hayward's going to be retiring soon. We have JJ locked up, which is great, but you're going to start to see some turnover at the linebacker core. I think we're going to lose Devin Bush after this year, things of that nature. So we'll see.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'll take any bets. Anyone who thinks he's starting before the bye week, I'll take your money. I still think we might see him later this year, but I think you're right. I wouldn't want to ruin the guy getting him started behind this offensive line either. All right, that's enough of that, says Kim. Matt, where can folks get a hold of you? How can they join everything that you've got going on at Solve for Why? What's the best place for people to reach you when they want to connect? Because a lot of folks are going to listen to this and say, I got to get me more of that Matt Berkey, man.
Sure. So on social media, I'm Berkey11 everywhere. On Twitter, we are Solve for Why, at Solve for Why TV. On Instagram, I think we're at Solve for Why Academy. You can check out the Solve for Why training site at solveforwhy.io. Free 2-week trial to anybody who signs up. If you sign up for the yearly, we're actually giving away Homeschool 2.0 with the yearly subscription. So for anybody interested in that, that's a 36-hour course, I believe, that was led by myself, Matt Hunt, Andrew Brokus, Landon Tice, Jesse Sylvia, and Russell Thomas. So a lot of great coaches under that umbrella. One of the best things that I think we've done. So yeah, for anybody interested, we're happy to have you. Otherwise, we put out some free content on YouTube. There's also a free membership at solveforwhy.io called the Free Roll Access Pass, where you can see like Academy footage and the to be determined movie.
That's wonderful. Well, Matt, I feel like everyone who listened to the show got smarter. We all know more about poker. I think we all know we have a lot more questions to ask and things to learn. So that's always a good sign. So thank you again for coming on. I can't wait to bend your ear another time soon, I hope.
Sure. Happy to have it.
All right, my friend. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. We're going to keep on rolling, talk about some home games and other stuff that's getting exciting over here. But folks, do go check out Matt on Twitter. Check out the Academy. Tell him that you had a great time on the Rec Poker podcast, and then we'll reel him back in here another time soon and pick his amazing poker brain again.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Cheers. Really appreciate it. Well, that was a good. I mean, you don't often get a chance like that. Felt like a tutorial, didn't it, gang? I just love soaking up the genius poker knowledge that we get from some of these guests. It's amazing.
Definitely sounded like a coaching session.
Yeah.
I think if you go back and just take all of Matt Berkey's when he's been on the our poker podcast, Rec Poker Podcast, and take Ryan LaPlante's when he's been on, and take those two guys, take these podcasts, and you've got quite a training program right there.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
You really do.
No, it's really, really impressive stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I know we've got to let Chris Jones go soon because we're recording our monthly seminar later tonight. So we'll just go through some home game results, and then we'll do our food bank drive draw. So it's not too late. Just toss the words food bank into the chat here in the YouTube chat, and then we'll see who's our winner of a free month at Solve for Why. So, John, what's been going on in home game land over the last little while? The last week, to be exact. And I'll remind you that you are muted.
Well, I find it's easier to talk when I'm not muted. So
it's easier for us to listen. I know that.
Yeah. Well, actually, it might be worse for you.
Here he goes. There he goes.
On September 19th, Poker Geek MN, John Somsky won his 7th nightly victory for the year. His
Even
8th overall.
Blind squirrel, huh?
How does that happen?
Rigged.
Well, if you remember, at the beginning of the year, I pronounced that I was half as good as Jacob Kiki and that I would win 10 games this year. I am on pace for that. So
there you go. That's impressive.
Then on September 20th, now then KB won his 7th nightly victory for the year. East Coast Spitter Ben Enslow won his 3rd nightly victory for the year. Carl 0621 won his 4th nightly victory for the year. And none other than Stewie 13 won his 8th nightly victory for the year.
Nice.
And not to be outdone, Keck Geek Sr. won his 6th nightly victory for the year.
Amazing.
Then in mixed events, K-Poker wannabe Ron Payton won his 1st daily mixed event for the year. Megger 44 came back and won his 4th international event for the year.
He's back.
And then Rick the Good Dog.
Oh my God.
Won his 2nd international victory for the year.
Does Rick the Good Dog ever enter tournaments and then not win those tournaments? Has anyone seen that happen?
I believe he has not won every tournament he has played.
Yeah, I've seen him. I've seen him go out once or twice in the home game before winning. So of course, I might have been imagining it.
Yeah,
yeah.
And we got a comment in the chat here, John. Benjamin Enslow got his full name this week. He was listening last week. There you go.
Yeah, and that's because he went to his profile and he made the things public that needed to be public, and now his name is there. Anyone can do that.
Anyone can do it.
And then for the LPP Sunday event, Poker Stars decided that there was just too much going on and canceled the tournament.
Wasn't a big day for them anyway, so no big loss. Just chalk it up there.
That was a rough one.
Yeah. I know, speaking of Ben Enslow, he was doing pretty well in a shot-taking tournament that got canceled. So I hope they took care of him. But that's always so disappointing. That's a bummer.
They did. He posted it in the Discord channel.
Awesome.
That he did get paid. So they did a ICM chop basically with whoever, that's how they do it. So
yeah, still that stinks. All right. Well, I think we've got 8 people that have entered the draw, starting with the RRRCCC. And the RRRCCC, I got an email from you claiming your prize from last week. I am sorry it's taken me so long to get back to you. I am just a little overwhelmed with emails and other things right now, so I am behind. But full credit for that. I'll be in touch shortly about how to claim that prize. But we're going to roll the die here. We got the magical, nerdy 8-sided die because there's 8 people in the draw. Start with the RRRCCC and work down from there. What do we got? It's a 1 again. Oh my God. We're going to have to start doing this like with the camera on the die because we're rolling 1s at a freaking unsustainable rate. Like I don't blame the listeners that are getting suspicious. But as Chris Jones has pointed out, it just means you got to be the first one to type your name in for the draw.
Type it in fast, and it makes your life easier now because the RRCC has to just get it 2 prizes there.
Yeah, that's right. I give 1 email, but yeah, way to go. So this free YouTube viewer has showed up for 2 interviews. They've won a free month at Rec Poker and a free month at Solve for Why. Like, it just goes to show, holy cow, folks, come and join the Rec Poker podcast for free every Monday evening at 7:30 Eastern on YouTube. And obviously, I would love it if you would just do what Donna Dark Angel says down there and click the old like and subscribe button. Oh, God, it feels weird saying that out loud, but it means a lot to us. We really do appreciate it. So thank you very much for that. Let me see. I think, Kim, I don't know if we have time to get into all the fun that's happening down in Cleveland. I know you're our foreign traveling correspondent right now, but can you confirm that you final tabled an exciting tournament and got to sniffing distance of a ring this week?
Yeah. Event number 2 of the Run Good Poker Series in Cleveland, Ohio. There's a few Rec Poker members down here, so hopefully I'll run into all of them.
There you go.
I did final table and ended up heads up, although we made an ICM chop at four-handed. So I didn't get the ring, almost got the ring.
Like one away from the ring.
Well, it's just there to keep driving on. It'll be there waiting for you when the time is right. But congratulations! I'm glad you're having fun down there. We love the Run Good Poker Tour, and Veronica Brill, who's coming down to Cleveland to join you and some of our friends, has told us, if you're wearing any Rec Poker gear and you go up to her and say hello, she is contractually obligated to buy you a beer. So don't let that opportunity pass you by, folks. If you're listening to this live, it's Monday night, September 26th. You still got tons of time to go bug Veronica and get your free Rec Poker beer. Look, premium membership only costs $15. Like, think about the beer rebate on that. Yeah.
They're not free in this casino. So
there you go.
It's going to cost her high-end stuff.
And Joe Cool says, you won a ring in my book, Kim. So there you go. You got some fans in the YouTube chat. Okay.
Thanks,
we gotta let Chris roll out of here. Thank you to everyone for joining us. The last piece of news I'm going to break is the time comes for all things. I've so much enjoyed listening to that tune as we roll into and out of our podcast every week. But we actually have brand new podcast bumper music brought to you by Steve Fredlin's old buddy, Pete, who we actually thought was the original music creator as well. There's a long story there, but long story short, I'm so excited that we were able to get together with Pete, and he's produced some awesome new bumper music for the podcast. So starting next week, you will hear the new intro, but just to get you get a little taste of it, we're going to start you with the new outro. So enjoy this, and while you're doing that, I want to thank our amazing sponsors, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, and Mark Vershawn at Website Amp, and Matt freaking Berkey. Are you kidding? Yeah. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to you, the listeners. All right. Have a good night, everybody. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next week.